Dobro večer, hvala vam što ste s nama večeras. A little bit of an echo. Ja se zovem Selma. Are you on?
I am, yeah.
Oh, okay, all right. Ja se zovem Selma Poča, za oni od vas koji me ne znaju. Izvršna sam direktorica Kongresa Bošnjaka Sjeverne Amerike. Many of you I recognize, ja ću malo dobaciti, ali na engleski lakše mi je, from previous events, so thank you all for being here again and for continuing to support the work of the Congress of Bosniaks in North America. I want to introduce our star of the hour, Dr. Jasmin Mujanovic, who I think needs no introduction because I think most of our people know who Jasmin is. But I want to just give him a warm welcome back to his hometown of Vancouver. I want to read a little bit about Jasmin's bio for those of you who don't know as much about what he does. So Dr. Jasmin Mujanovic is a political scientist, PhD from York University, specializing in the politics of post-authoritarian and post-conflict democratization. He is the author of 2 books, Hunger and Fury, The Crisis of Democracy in the Balkans, by Hearst Publishers and Oxford University Press, and The Bosniaks, Nationhood After Genocide, also Hearst Publishers and Oxford University Press. His publications also include a host of peer-reviewed articles, chapters in numerous edited volumes, policy reports for an assortment of international and regional think tanks, as well as popular analyses in the New York Times, the Washington Post, The Guardian, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, and other leading global media. He has a prominent social media presence and makes regular appearances for international television and radio programs, including numerous Balkan media outlets. Originally from Sarajevo, he is a senior non-residency fellow at the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy, based out of Washington, D.C. In other words, he's pretty fantastic. So thank you.
You're smart to eat.
Yeah, I know, you always cringe. I kind of but it's over. You should go here. Before we get into questions about Jasmin's book, which is pretty fantastic, and I hope some of you have had a chance to get it and read it before the talk, and I think it will be a really interesting discussion. We did want to do a quick poll on the topic of the hour, and that is the Bosniaks. We live in a time, I think, where a lot of people are going through this sort of, learning more about their identity, especially those of us who are diaspora communities, who have been living here a long time, and especially those of us who identify in a way that maybe has been discriminated against for a very, very long time. We start questioning why was I exterminated, why was I killed, why was I in a concentration camp, why was I this, why was I that? I think this book really tackles a lot of those issues for all of us, so I want to do a quick poll before we get, let's see, this thing will listen to me. So you guys can interact with the poll. If you have your phones, if you scan the QR code, it will take you to a text box so that you can tell us, oh, did they say up there?
That's from last night. Those were the
How do we
responses
clear
from last
that?
night.
What? That's not good. Reset results. But it doesn't affect anything, you guys see it. So you can, again, scan the QR code and just give us the one word that you think of first when I say the word Bosniaks. A minute or 30 seconds. Identity, Muslim, strength, Yugoslavia. Anybody else? Trying to give their answers? Here we go. Muslim genocide, Ghazi Muslim, from the land of Bosnia. Sounds like maybe something made by people. People of the heartland, Muslim. Okay. Bosnia Muslim, we're still going. Awesome. Well, I mean, there's a variety of responses here. The reason I wanted to do this is because I wanted to sort of challenge the premise of the book, and that is Jasmin's definition of a Bosniak in this book. So if you don't mind, Jasmin, doing a quick reading of that part of the book that talks about how you define Bosniaks.
Sure, yeah. So first of all, thanks to everyone who's come out. Very kind of you. I have to point out that not only is Vancouver, I guess you said hometown, SFU is my alma mater. So it's especially nice to be here. So look, those of you who have maybe had a chance to look at the book, those who have not, that's fine. When you write an academic book or something that sort of has at least some academic resonance, especially those of you who are still students, you have to define your terms. So I had to offer my own definition of what the Bosniaks are. And we'll talk a lot more, I think, this evening about sort of competing definitions. So I'll just give you sort of the definition I offer in this book, and then we'll go from there. So I read here, the Bosniak nation is here defined as a community who believe themselves to be indigenous to the historic Bosnian lands, who continue to identify with and support Bosnia-Herzegovina as a distinct and sovereign polity, and maintain the existence of an accompanying distinct Bosnian cultural and linguistic identity, and who, though they are predominantly, and I put in brackets, culturally Muslim, maintain claims to both pre-Islamic and pre-Christian, a pre-Islamic and pre-Christian past as organic features of their historic national identity, which they also cite as conceptual proof of their ancestral belonging to the historic Bosnian lands. The historic Bosnian lands, in turn, refer to the idea that the historic boundaries and borders of Bosnia-Herzegovina have remained remarkably consistent, unlike most neighboring polities, and have thus allowed a distinct Bosnian identity and attachment to Bosnia-Herzegovina to emerge among large segments of the country's population, the primary, though not exclusive, partisans of which today are the Bosniaks. Especially since the events of the 1990s, significant portions of both the Serb and Croat communities in Bosnia-Herzegovina have progressively abandoned affiliation with any aspect of their historic and likewise indigenous presence in the country. In other words, as greater numbers of Bosnian Serbs and Bosnian Croats have rejected their Bosnianness, the Bosniaks have inherited a larger claim to it.
Thank you.
There you go. Thank you.
Do you want to add anything else on that point before we move into the questions?
Well, I guess the joke about academics, at least social scientists, is that you all end up writing and working on your own trauma. So that's, I think, this book in many ways is my, shall we say, intellectual effort at trying to work through questions of identity. Because the big chip on my shoulder, having been born in Sarajevo and then, our family fleeing, and then, you watch sort of the coverage of the CNNs of the world and the BBCs, and those of you who remember those very unfortunate years, you'll remember that standard line about the war as it was described and who the combatants of the war are. And the line was always, this is a war between Serbs, Croats, and Muslims. And even as a kid, I had a pretty big problem with that because there's an obvious logical fallacy there, right? Because two of those are ethnic or national communities, and one of them is a religious community. And notwithstanding the fact that very large numbers, overwhelming numbers of Bosniaks do in fact identify as Muslims, there's the problem that many don't. I come from a very secular family. I'm not religious whatsoever, but I very much believe and accept the idea that there is a kind of, shall we say, cultural religious identity, right? In the US, lots of folks will say, I'm culturally Jewish. And I think for many Bosniaks in practice, there's a kind of cultural experience of Islam and Muslimness as well. And that, to me, at the end of the day, also meant that the way that the Bosniak community was talked about and written about in the West, I found for the most part did not represent my lived experience of what it meant to be Bosniak, what it meant to be Bosnian. It was hyper-focused on this idea of Muslimness and Islamic identity, which again is very important to many members of our community, but is not the only important aspect. And I, specifically in this book, argue that the thing that defines the Bosniak community ultimately is not actually their Muslimness, it is their relationship to Bosnia and their claim to use a big fancy highfalutin academic term, this notion of indigeneity, right? The idea of being indigenous, originating from, and believing themselves to be ancestral Bosnians, while also simultaneously not denying the fact that there are other indigenous Bosnian communities, Serbs, Croats, and others as well. So there. Thanks for coming. Bye.
That was it. No, just kidding. No, I mean, that's fantastic, and I think it really segues nicely into my question, or my first question, and it has to do with a little bit with what's on this next slide. And that is that Bosnians and Bosniaks, the geographical position, straddling the cultural and geopolitical divide between the East and the West has always been a challenge, and you talk about that extensively in your book. And I feel like most Bosniaks you talk to us, oh, we're just such a unique people. Oh, yes, anyway, that's how we identify with ourselves sometimes. And so, you talk in this book about our religious identity. So we weren't Catholic, we weren't Orthodox. The Bogomil faith turned into the Church of Bosnia, which was very unique. It was heretical in the eyes of both the Catholic and the Orthodox churches. And Bosniaks are proud of this history. We don't deny our early Christian roots. We don't deny, or we actually embrace and are proud of having adopted Islam.
Sure.
And yet, we're still, and it's our Croat and Serb counterparts or compatriots in our country, or especially the nationalist ones who have kind of adopted Croatia and Serbia as their national homelands rather than Bosnia. They call us the heretics, they call us the traitors, yet they have sort of abandoned their historical lands, which is the lands of Bosnia, which you talk about in your book. I guess what I wanted to ask you is, can you elaborate on this Bosnian, this idea a little bit more? How did you arrive at that and your process in writing this book? It sounds like it was a little bit of an identity. I mean, you mentioned that earlier, right? You talked about it being like your own trauma experience, but can you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, look, and I think you stumble upon sort of the main aspect of it, which is that, I mean, in my experience, just kind of growing up, not even like doing research on it, just like growing up as a Bosnian and then as a Bosniak, and perhaps because I do have a little bit of a unique situation in the sense that, I have a lot of access to Bosnia and I spend a lot of time there, but I'm also obviously, live in the US and engage with our diaspora and what have you. And it just really became apparent to me at some point that there was a really fundamental disconnect about some basic terminology and some basic conceptual terms, both in terms of how sort of Americans, Canadians, whatever, Germans talked about Bosnia and Bosniaks and how we ourselves talked about it. And to me, the primary point of contention, and especially when I would talk to, like ambassadors, foreign ministers, et cetera, for them, it was Muslimness and Islamic identity which was the defining characteristic of the Bosniak community. Which then also meant that, well, it meant one of two things. Either the response was like exotic, like, ooh, white Muslims. Which also is, deeply problematic in the way that it fetishizes certain racial categories. Or it was, ooh, Muslims, right? And so this is the sort of, shall we say, Viktor Orban school of European politics. He had this statement a year or 2 years ago, where in speaking about his engagement with other European leaders, and he said, we Hungarians have a particular sort of concern about the Balkans and Bosnia and Herzegovina in particular, because, and he says, there are 2 million Muslims there.
How do we integrate 2 million Muslims?
Yeah, no, he didn't even mention the idea of integration. What he says is there are 2 million Muslims there, and therefore the fact of there being Muslims is in and of itself a security threat and a security concern. And so my kind of experience was, or my kind of consistent frustration was, okay, I get that you may or may not have concerns about Muslims and Islam and all the rest of it, but you have to understand that the primary identifying characteristic of this community is their belief in their Bosnian identity. And I mean, they say don't judge a book by its cover, but my choice of this cover was very pointed, and I do talk about in the book this very important moment in the early 1990s, the independence cause, and so you have this moment where doubtlessly it is the case while there was a lot of Bosnian Croats and Bosnian Serbs who also supported Bosnia's independence, and in fact they have been grossly sort of undercounted, right? Nevertheless, it is also simultaneously the case that, shall we say, the primary partisans of the cause of Bosnian independence were ethnic Bosniaks. And so at that moment, Bosniaks, for the first time since the medieval period, have an opportunity to secure the sovereignty of the Bosnian state. And what do they choose to put on their flag? And this is really interesting, and I think a lot of folks, even in our own community, don't think about this very much, and I find that kind of funny. So we choose, as it were, the coat of arms of the Kotromanic dynasty of the medieval Bosnian state. And, you know, everyone knows and many people appreciate the lilies. Okay, but here's the thing. What are lilies? Right? What is the symbolic representation of lilies? They're crosses. The lily is a sign of Marian devotion, i.e. the Virgin Mary. So you have a community, 99% of which identifies as being Muslim, and they choose to put not one, but 6 crosses on their flag, right? And that only makes sense. That only makes sense if you accept the fact that for that community, their identity with Bosnia and their claim to being an ancestral people of Bosnia fundamentally overrides virtually every other form of identification, and also that it is a nod to other Bosnians, most of whom are various Christian denominations, saying this is also your homeland. And we have no qualms about the idea that although our community today is overwhelmingly Muslim, at one time they were Christian. Because the thing that runs through that history is not religion, it's not faith, it's indigeneity to this land. We are first and foremost Bosnians. And if you choose to also be first and foremost Bosnians, then this can be a homeland for all of us.
No, I mean, what do you say to people who, and this isn't in the questions, but I thought of it as you were talking, what do you say to people who say, well, the lilies are there not because they're a French symbol and a cross, etc., but because we have the Bosnian lily that grows in all of the mountainous regions of Bosnia, and so they again are associating to the land more than anything else. Do you say that that's, I mean, it's just... That's
fine, you can have that interpretation, but the fact of the matter is this is the coat of arms of the Kotromanic dynasty.
Absolutely.
I mean, that was very, very clear.
Oh, yeah.
And they were doubtlessly a Christian dynasty.
Yeah.
Right? There's no historical debate. There were, I mean, mind you, there were members of the Kotromanic dynasty, some of whom were Catholics, some of whom were Orthodox, some of whom were or were suspected to be adherents of the Bosnian Church, which was contentious because it was, in particular by the Vatican, identified as being a heretical church, and that's where our good friends in Hungary again stepped in to have a succession of crusades in Bosnia, right? But whatever the case may be, there is an indelible relationship with the idea of Bosnianness and a history of Bosnia as a sovereign and distinct polity.
You talk about genocide a lot in the book. It's one of the focal points. Well, it's not the focal point, but it's something that is very important to the point that you're trying to make. And you talk about, you specifically choose to call it the Bosnian genocide. You don't call it the Srebrenica genocide. You never negate that Srebrenica was a genocide. It's not in that sense. It's to say, a genocide cannot be committed on a city. It can only be committed on a people.
Right.
The definition of a genocide is trying to exterminate in whole or in part a group of people. In this case, the majority of them being Bosniaks in Bosnia. And so, I wanted to touch on the topic of the term Bosnian genocide, and I wanted to touch on it twofold. One, you talk about multiple German rulings where there have been war criminals convicted of having committed genocide in other parts of Bosnia that were not Srebrenica. We also have the 2 rulings of Stanisic and Simatovic last year, which directly implicated Serbia in the criminal enterprise that resulted in the genocide across Bosnia. And so now that we sort of have those doors open still, is there still a I know you're not an attorney, and we talked about this yesterday, but what are your views on sort of using that term, and is it dangerous, and is it undermining the ruling of the Srebrenica genocide?
So, it's a good question, and this is a question that continues to keep coming up, and I think it's important to come up. So here's the thing. It is obviously hugely important that we have the ICTY Srebrenica genocide ruling. It is also factually the case, as you said, that in the late 90s and the early 2000s, there was other rulings that came down primarily from German national courts, which found that a number of VRS participants had participated in acts of genocide, the crime of genocide in places like Foča, Prijedor, etc. And also by sheer virtue of the universal jurisdiction that is associated with the crime of genocide, those rulings by those German courts are as valid and sort of legally important as the rulings of the ICTY. But here's the thing. My big issue with the term the genocide in Srebrenica or the Srebrenica genocide is because it is a depoliticization of what actually happened during the 1990s. Because we don't do this with any other genocide. No one talks about the genocide in Auschwitz versus the genocide in Buchenwald. We talk about the Holocaust because we recognize that there was a singular project of extermination directed against the Jewish community of Europe under the Nazi regime. We talk about the Armenian genocide. We talk about the Rwandan genocide. In this country, we have begun talking about the notion of the Canadian state having committed genocide against the Indigenous and First Peoples of Canada. Right? We recognize the singularity of the political project. So how is it possible that in Bosnia, that the same crimes committed by the same people at the same time against the same community for the same purpose are not part of the same political project? What are we suggesting? That the people who were exterminated and raped and expelled in Srebrenica were in a bubble, but the people 15 kilometers down the road in Foča or Zvornik or Žepa, they were what? Not being killed for the same reason? This is a really bizarre construction. And so I have been very, this has been a little bit of a, I mean, I'm not the only one, but I've been on a little bit of a personal crusade, as it were, to change some of the normative and scholarly ways in which we talk about this, because I do think the appropriate term for this is the genocide in Bosnia, the Bosnian genocide, if you will. And I will also have to say, I very much take the position that, because Srebrenica absolutely was the apex horror of the genocide in Bosnia and the apex horror of the aggression against Bosnia, that community, in particular the community that is still in the Srebrenica-Bratunac area, they are, in a sense, our guardians of a certain aspect of our story, though they will be the first to tell you that this is our shared story. I mean, as Emir Suljagic, who's the director of the Memorial Center, says, if it had not been for the siege of Sarajevo, there never would have been a genocide in Srebrenica. Right? If the Bosnian army could have reached Srebrenica, if it could have reached Žepa, if it could have reached Zvornik, things wouldn't have played out the way they did. But what I want to highlight here is that about 2 years ago, I did a project. I was the main editor of something that we ended up calling the Bosnian Genocide Reader through the Srebrenica Memorial Center. This was basically a packet of literature that we put together, essays and various things, that were instruction materials for high school teachers, university lecturers, et cetera, who wanted to maybe teach the history of this. And the first question, when we came up with the idea of the title, was, to the community in Srebrenica, do you approve this? And they were the first ones that said, absolutely. Absolutely. So this is the thing, and the final point that I want to make here is, all of this comes down to something very, very simple. Namely, the responsibility for talking about and educating about the facts of the genocide and the aggression against Bosnia belong to us. If the ICTY had ruled that no genocide had occurred in Srebrenica, it still would be a genocide. It doesn't matter in that sense what the international tribunals may or may not say. It is certainly beneficial from a practical political standpoint that we do have the weight of international law on our side. But had those rulings never come down, we would still have the right and the moral responsibility to talk about our own experience on our own terms,
And yet we had suffered 3 in the past 200 years prior to Srebrenica and the Bosnian genocide, and we didn't.
Exactly, and this is, I mean, part of the mission of this book, in a sense, is to provide narratives, right? To provide a coherent sense of self-understanding for members of our community. Because as you say, every act of genocide, every atrocity is a rupture. Stories are lost. People are lost. Communities are lost. As my good friend Hadis Alilovic in Melbourne told me when I was there recently, he said, you know, my grandmother was expelled from her same village in eastern Bosnia 4 times over the course of her life. 4 times by the same people. All right? But each time that there is that displacement, there is a rupture. And we know even through just the mere practice of intergenerational trauma, you know, those of you who are perhaps younger in the room, you know, you want to talk to your mom and dad, you want to talk to your grandparents, perhaps you were born in Canada, you were born in the US, you want to get in touch with that history. Well, what you're going to find is that your own parents and your own elders oftentimes are unreliable narrators. Not because they're bad people, but because that is the consequence of trauma. So we need people who are able in our community to help us tell our own stories. And I don't think I've written the book. I don't think this is going to be far and away from the final word. It's just an attempt to start that process.
Absolutely. And I guess to go on this topic, I completely agree. I think education is crucial, and I think one of the ways that we educate is across the country. Many of our communities get together, they gather, they commemorate in some way. They remember the victims, they honor the survivors. And one of the, as you know, one of the things that's going to happen this year for the first time in the United States or North American soil is we're going to have a central commemoration ceremony for the Srebrenica genocide in Chicago, in Illinois. We're partnering with the Illinois Holocaust Museum to do that, and with the Islamic community of North American Bosniaks. We have our Mufti Cheman here with us tonight. Thank you for being here, and for the support and the partnership in this program. We are also working with really important organizations such as the Srebrenica Memorial Center and others who are going to be part of this story, a really important story to tell together in this moment with everything that's going on in the world, and to send a lot of messages, I think, that need to be sent to a lot of people, not just to our own people, but especially to American audiences. And so this program is coming up, and you know, you sort of compare radical elements of the U.S. to that of Bosnia, and shockingly, when you compare, you know, how many people identify themselves as conservative in Bosnia, the number was actually much smaller than the numbers in the U.S., which was really surprising. How many people were really kind of strict followers, churchgoers, which was really interesting. Yet we are somehow always labeled as radicals, even though statistically that does not add up.
Right.
And so you also tie in your book something that I think is really important for people to know. It's, okay, we can do a commemoration, but how do we make sure that the people that are there actually care about what we're talking about? How do we make it relevant to them? And one of the things is, you know, this Serb nationalism that keeps popping up all around the globe.
Sure.
And then there's a thread that ties it back to what was done to us for 200 years. So can you talk a little bit more about that and make those connections for our audience?
Sure. So I started kind of in a serious way writing about the genocide in Bosnia following a surge in basically far-right terrorist attacks in various parts of the West, in Norway, in New Zealand, in the United States. Because what I had begun noticing among the actual perpetrators of those terrorist attacks was that they had an intense familiarity with ideological political motifs of Serb nationalism. The most striking articulation of this was the massacre in Christchurch, New Zealand, where the perpetrator of that attack on a local Islamic center and mosque, where he killed more than 50 people, had done one of several things. A, on the rifle, on the weapon that he had used to perpetrate the massacre, he had written the names of various Serb nationalist figures from the 19th century onwards. He had written their names even on the bullets. while he was driving to the Islamic Center in Christchurch, he had live streamed himself, and in the background, very loudly, you could hear him playing the song, That song, a Serb nationalist propaganda song from the 1990s, had already become extremely popular on the sort of Western online community, not initially among the far right, initially on gaming websites, and it was known as the quote-unquote remove kebab meme, i.e. kebab referring to Muslim peoples, right, and a derogatory, a slurred term. And so he refers to himself in this quote-unquote manifesto, he refers to himself as a kebab removalist. Anders Breivik, the neo-Nazi in Norway, who had also killed more than 200 people, wrote a 1,000-page manifesto in which there are more than 1,000 references to Bosnia, Kosovo, the dissolution of Yugoslavia, all through the exclusive prism of Serb nationalism. The so-called Great Replacement conspiracy theory, which you will hear actual mainstream politicians in the United States espousing, has in part its roots in certain Serb nationalist motifs, which styled Serbia and the sort of Serb community as the proverbial defenders of Christendom, and the idea that the presence of indigenous Muslim peoples in Southeastern Europe, Bosniaks, Albanians, and others, that this was actually an invasion force, much in the same way that you have officials in the United States today who talk about immigration, documented or otherwise, as a form of invasion. So to me, I started having to have conversations with folks in the American law enforcement community, intelligence community, folks in the UK, folks in Canada, saying, look, the same way that we have had to study far-right ideological constructs and interests in things like the Holocaust, the Confederacy, apartheid South Africa, so on and so forth. I said, what we're seeing here is the incorporation of Serb nationalist ideological motifs and narratives into the Western far right. The Western far right, Western neo-Nazis, are looking to people like Karadzic and Mladic and Milosevic and all the rest of them, Šešelj, and saying, aha, these are models for us. These are men who did what we want to do in these societies. They look to Mladic and Šešelj and say, we want to do that here, to our Muslim communities, to our black and brown people. And that's where the significance of our historical experience, the genocide that was committed against our people, begins to resonate in a slightly different way for folks, again, in Canada and the US, etc.
Well, and I think talking about far-right radicalization and Christian extremism and radicalization is a topic that is now being looked at a lot more, in a lot more detail and being talked about than it was before. It was always, terrorist, oh, he's Muslim, right? That term was sort of reserved for Muslims. Everybody else had mental health issues, right? Because they shoot people up. I mean, that's the reality of what we see on TV. And so, I want to then kind of, from that point of this Serb nationalism that has caused all of these atrocities around the world, talk to you a little bit about the idea of the Serbian state as a celestial polity, as a defender of Christendom. And kind of tie that in with comments that were told to, that you cite in your book, that were told to President Clinton when he was pushing on the European Union to lift the arms embargo, why that was relevant, why they were essentially told, yeah, no thanks, and allowed us to be slaughtered. And then tie that into, well, now we are in negotiations on the EU accession path. What can we expect from a Europe today that said what they said then? And I'll let you kind of tell our audience what that conversation was like that you cite in your book.
Sure. So, those of you who may remember the governments of people like John Major in the UK or Mitterrand in France and others, they had an unequivocal issue with the Bosnian independence cause because they saw it as being synonymous with the Bosniak community, a term which was to them, synonymous with Muslims. And for that generation of European leaders, Muslims in Europe were a historical mistake, right? These were people who should have disappeared because they were alien, they said, to Europe to begin with. Now, that on the face of it obviously is objectively false, right? Like, as long as there has been a European history, there have been Muslims in Europe, there have been black and brown people in Europe. So it was a non-starter from a factual standpoint. But that was the view. That was the view. And in that sense, there was also always a kind of synergy between certain kinds of Western far-right discourses about Bosnia and the war in Bosnia and Serb and Croat nationalist disinformation campaigns about the war in Bosnia. Because, for those of us who not only believed that the Bosniak political cause was legitimate and just, but that also the Bosnian independence cause was separate, and also that it necessarily also involved Croats and Serbs and people who chose to identify just as Bosnians and many others, that it was not synonymous with the Bosniak community, who looked very proudly upon Jovan Divjak and Željko Komšić and hundreds of others who gave their lives in defense of that political project. We were very proud of that and remain very proud of that. But we're continuously told that, those people were not, to borrow a contemporary term from contemporary Croat nationalist discourses, they were not legitimate. Right? Željko Komšić apparently is not a legitimate Croat. Because apparently the person that you need to ask in Bosnia about whether or not you can be a Croat is Dragan Čović. And if Dragan doesn't halali, you're not a Croat. Which is, to use an academic term, insane. Right? But this is the thing. Those kinds of discourses were normalized at that time, and they continue to be normalized. Now here's the thing. You asked me about that relationship with the EU. Let's be very clear. Bosnia today is an EU candidate state and a negotiating candidate state. And that has absolutely nothing to do with us, the current government, or the previous government. If you're thankful for that, you can send an email to the Kremlin.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Moldova, Ukraine, Bosnia, maybe Georgia. We'll see how this shakes out, what's happening over there right now. These countries have a European perspective right now, officially, because of the second invasion of Ukraine and the aggression and occupation of Ukraine by the fascist regime in Moscow. Here's the thing. Spoiler. We do not have a European perspective. We are not going to join the European Union in what I refer to as a biologically relevant time frame. You and I almost certainly are not going to live to see it. But, that shouldn't be the point. The point should be that we extract the maximum gain and resources available to us through that process to strengthen Bosnian institutions, Bosnian democracy, Bosnian sovereignty for its own sake. Because a democratic state based on civic equality, in line with the European Declaration of Human Rights, or rather Convention on Human Rights, that is in our interest. If that happens to have as one of its consequences our eventual membership in the EU, great. If it doesn't, so what? Right? That's the thing. And what this comes down to, ultimately, and I'll stop on this point and then leave, what this comes down to is there is a very problematic aspect to our collective political culture. We were talking about this on the drive up. And we can talk about the complex psychological, political, and historical reasons for why this might be. But Bosnians, and I think Bosniaks in particular, have a very unfortunate tendency of looking to others to solve their own problems. And the best way I can illustrate this to you, and somebody last night got really mad at me when I said this, and I'm sure there will be somebody in the room tonight as well, and I want you to listen very carefully, because I'm probably not going to say what you think I'm saying. All of us who are from Bosnia, generally, have a very, very critical attitude and disposition towards the Dayton Peace Agreement. I criticize it extensively in this book. It's discriminatory, it's ridiculous, it's Byzantine, Dayton was unjust, da. And I'll be the first one to agree with you. And I wrote a book about it, so I agree with you, so we can take that as read. Here's the part that we misunderstand and ignore. When you go to the State Department, when you go to the US Congress, and you talk to those American officials about Dayton, they think it's arguably the most successful act of American diplomacy in the last 40 years. Because Dayton did what the United States wanted to do. The United States wanted to stop the war in Bosnia. It did not care about the quality of that peace agreement or the successive constitutional regime that is embedded in that peace agreement. If you ask Tony Blinken and Gabe Escobar and Derek Chollet and Matthew Palmer, these leading lights of the current State Department, do you think it is just that someone who is Jewish cannot be a member of the Bosnian presidency? That Derva Sejdic, who is Romani, cannot be a member of the Bosnian presidency? No. But they'll say that's up to you. That's up to you. We did what we wanted and what we needed to do. The rest is up to you. And so here's the disconnect. We continue to insist on the fact that fixing Dayton is their problem. Now, it might be their problem, but it will only be their problem if we make it their problem. And you'll never make it their problem if you just keep asking people to fix it. That'll never happen. So the way you fix it is by the work, for instance, that you do. Right? You actually go and engage with people. You talk to them. You explain to them. You are a fly in their ointment. Right? I'll tell you something right now. I mean, I was recently in Kosovo, and I had, we were talking about the so-called Association of Serbian Municipalities. And I was very critical of it, and I said, Prime Minister Albin Kurti is absolutely right, this will be another Republika Srpska, da. And after the panel finished, a high-ranking international official in Kosovo came up to me and said, I absolutely disagree with you. And I said, that's okay, that's right, I don't mind. And he said to me, why can't the people of Kosovo, because they are so democratic and so progressive, and we've given them these guarantees that the ASM will not be another Republika Srpska. Why can't they just do it? Because look, we're backing them. We're all saying, the Americans, the Germans, the French, everyone is saying, we won't let it happen. And I said, because they can look over at Bosnia and see that you're lying. Because the Republika Srpska in Bosnia is not the Republika Srpska that we agreed to. For 20 years, that regime under Milorad Dodik has stepped outside of the constitutional and political bounds of the Dayton Agreement and the Dayton Constitution. And what has the international community done?
What's even funnier is they've said, we'll make sure you don't get a Republika Srpska.
And here's the other question. Here's the other question following exactly from that. Wait a minute. If the Association of Serbian Municipalities is okay for Kosovo, why is an Association of Serbian Municipalities not okay in Bosnia? Let's devolve the entity.
Or Bosniak municipalities in Serbia.
If we're going down that road. Oh, no. Aha. So here's the thing. Our job is to be a problem. Our job is to be a problem. Dragan Čović, who I made a little joke about earlier, had a line in an interview that he gave to a certain Croat nationalist outfit. And it was a fantastic line, and I wish every single self-identifying Bosnian and Bosniak had read it, listened to it, and made it part of their being. He said, the first time I ever went to the Europeans and the Americans, and I told them that I wanted a new election law in Bosnia that was going to basically, as he puts it, cement the concept of so-called legitimate representation, i.e. further segregation, further sectarianism. So the first time I went and talked to them, they laughed at me. The second time I went, they laughed at me. The third time I went, they laughed at me. The fourth time, all right, Dragan, okay, yeah, sure, whatever. They ignored me. The fifth time, they ignored me. And I kept going back, and I kept going back, and I kept going back, and I kept going back. And he got it. And he got it in the end. He got a concept that is not in line with the European Convention on Human Rights. What Christian Schmidt did on behalf of Dragan Čović in October of 2022 and April of 2023 is against the European Convention on Human Rights.
And it's still passed.
And it's still passed. Because politics is about what you can do and realize, not what is morally right and ethically justified. It's good to have morals and ethics on your side. But if it's the only thing you have on your side, you got nothing.
I guess to continue off the Dayton and the discrimination within the Constitution, a lot of people blame President Izetbegovic for, signing it. Many people are very critical of him for having done it, etc. You have a very, I think, detailed analysis of President Izetbegovic. You spent some time, I think, pondering some of his works, pondering how the West views him. Is it fair or not? You even compare him to Western philosophers who were conservative, but they were not considered radical in any way, shape, or form, and yet President Izetbegovic was very much considered a radical by many. And so I wanted to kind of ask you to elaborate on your journey through, I guess, President Izetbegovic's literature, because I know you said you read some of it, obviously you read for the book, because you don't agree that he was a radical figure. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
I mean, look, this, again, the discourse about Izetbegovic as, supposed Islamist, et cetera, I mean, has to be understood in the context, right? And the context is the attempt to paint the Bosniak community tutto completo as being synonymous with, like, jihadis, right? Now, as somebody who daily is accused of being everything from a jihadi to a communist to, various sexual slurs, a diseased liberal, et cetera, I've got it all covered. It's clear to me that this discourse about Izetbegovic is, as I said, part of a broader dehumanization campaign. So here's the point of the book and the discussion about Izetbegovic in the book. Not to defend him, but to actually have a conversation about it. If you want to criticize Izetbegovic, you should criticize him on the basis of what he actually did, not what you imagine that he did. Right? So here's the thing. Izetbegovic was doubtlessly a conservative political figure. He identified himself and he thought of himself first and foremost as a Muslim theologian. And he had all kinds of conservative ideas. But conservative in a broadly, let's say, mainstream sense. Because he was also very clear about the fact that he's a Democrat. And so I put him in the context of a generation of intellectuals and theologians in the political West, in particular in places like Catholic theologians in France and Germany, who were writing at the same time. And they were all writing pretty much about the same thing, as religious figures trying to find a middle way or a separate third way between what they saw as the excesses of Western liberalism and the Soviet Union. And that was, in a sense, Izetbegovic's intellectual project. The other thing that's oftentimes really lost in the story of Izetbegovic and the SDA is that Izetbegovic was in prison until the very late 1980s, right? The SDA becomes the primary political vehicle of the Bosniak community after the first political elections in Bosnia and Herzegovina. But that party, at that point, is less than 2 years old. Every other major political party in Bosnia and Yugoslavia at that time is growing directly out of the communist regime. There is only one, shall we say, anti-system political party in the whole of the former Yugoslavia, and that was the SDA. A party, incidentally, that I am very critical of, do not share any ideology with, have never voted for. But again, you have to understand them on the facts of the ground, right? That then ties into the idea of the Dayton Agreement. And I think Izetbegovic took the position, and we may disagree with it, as he said himself, that an unjust peace was superior to an ongoing war. And that in itself is actually a reflection of, among other things, I think his deep-seated commitment to the idea of democratic change. Because he believed, you can even say this was cynical, but he believed ultimately that the Bosniak community, with whom he was primarily concerned, could better realize in the long term its political objectives in a even semi-functional democratic regime in Bosnia than during the war. And I think as a religious figure also probably believed that, not that the defense of Bosnia was immoral, but that if he could act to ensure peace, he had a responsibility to do that. And in many ways, I will say to you, as somebody who writes critically about Bosnia a lot, that last assessment that he had about that the Bosniak community could best achieve its political aims, however you want to define them, in peacetime, he was right. He was right. Bosnia is dysfunctional, it's a mess, it's incoherent. We have people who, they shouldn't be valets, never mind government ministers, in power. But, this is the most sustained period of political emancipation, democratization that Bosnia and the Bosniak community within it have ever had. This very bizarre and ridiculous Dayton construct is the most sustained experience with parliamentary democracy that we've ever had. And it's the first time that, well, among other things, books like this are able to be written, translated into Bosnian, and very importantly, I think most importantly, that they're translated into Bosnian, read in Bosnian, and then, as has happened over the last few days, reviews of the book come out, and one review says, this is a great book, I really enjoyed it, I think folks should read it, and another person compares me to Slobodan Milosevic. And I think that's fantastic, because that demonstrates to me that this is a increasingly liberal and democratic society. I would like to believe that I have nothing in common with Slobodan Milosevic, but I think it's fantastic that that gentleman who wrote that book, or pardon me, wrote that review, has the ability to publish that. That is the Bosnia that I want.
Yeah, and we to come back to the beginning of the question related to President Izetbegovic, we talked about this on the drive up, how in 1997 he went to Tehran and he told the leaders in Tehran how the Western world is not rotten, that we need to emulate them and that we need to learn from those who do things better than we do, and that democracy functions better in the West, and then we need to do that more. And so this is the radical figure that everybody talks about, a guy that goes to Iran and tells everybody we need to be more like the West. I guess to move on to a little bit of what happened during former Yugoslavia. You heavily criticize both the Republic of Yugoslavia and more so the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. You talk about the multiple exterminations of Bosniaks. You talk about over 400,000 hectares of land being taken from wealthy Bosniak families and then being settled by Serbs from Serbia and Montenegro. What do you say to those, there are many, who still defend and swear by Yugoslavia today, a kingdom that set, and republic that set Bosniaks back probably 200 years?
I mean, so we talked about this extensively last night, and this is one of the topics that keeps coming up. I mean, here's the thing. What we refer to oftentimes is this idea of Yugo-nostalgia, right? This positive view or positive romantic view of the communist regime. I mean, first and foremost, I think it's a form of social trauma, right? Like, it's a form of social trauma because of everything that happened afterwards. And so people by definition want to look back to oftentimes what they think was the last good moment in their life. And when people talk about Yugoslavia, that Titoist Yugoslavia, they also have a very selective memory. Because 9 times out of 10, when you start probing people and you tell me, okay, what was this good Yugoslavia that you're talking about? Here's what they say. We had a decent job, we vacationed, you know, the music was good, the kids could freely roam on the streets, you know, whatever. My best friend was a Serb, my neighbor was a Croat, blah, 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 blah. Dugme Olimpijada. No one ever says, you know what I really enjoyed about Yugoslavia? The 12th Congress of the League of Communists. Best Congress. Awesome Congress. Really loved that one. That was good. You know why nobody ever talks about that? Because the way that people remember Yugoslavia, they remember it as a social experience. They do not remember it as a political experience. And they also sequester it in a chronological sense. Because really what people are talking about are the period from about, maybe generously, 74 to about 81, I would say. People skip 82, 83, and they go to 84 because in Bosnia, because of the Olympics. But they tend to, for instance, disregard what was happening in Kosovo in 81. Right? That the 4th largest community in Yugoslavia, the Albanian community, there were more Albanians in Yugoslavia than Montenegrins, than Macedonians or Slovenes, who were already at that time living in a virtual police state. We don't talk about that. We also don't talk about the Yugoslavia that existed between, say, 45 and 48, or 48 and 51, 52, when the Titoist regime was essentially a Stalinist regime. Right? They don't talk about the forced unveiling campaigns of Bosniak women that were happening during that time. They don't talk about Aleksandar Abramović. They talk about Dugme Olimpijada. Now here's the thing. I get that. That's fine. That's okay, especially for people who lived through that. But what I do object to is the idea that future, up-and-coming Bosnians and Bosniaks should necessarily have to somehow pay homage to what was by definition an authoritarian regime. A regime that did not allow the Bosniak community to identify itself in the way that it wanted to.
I was going to say, can you comment on that?
Yeah.
On census issues? Since
Right,
we're on this
the
topic
Muslim
now.
by nationality,
Yeah.
maloma, velkoma, hoo-ha. Right? No one wants to talk about that version of Yugoslavia. No one wants to talk about also the fact that virtually all of the architects of the Bosnian genocide, of the aggression against Bosnia, of the aggression against Croatia, of the aggression against Kosovo, of the aggression against Slovenia, they were all members of that Titoist regime. Now people say, oh, you can't put that on Tito. Okay, I want to put it on Tito. Fine, you can do whatever. That's fine. But you cannot then also simultaneously insist that people who are coming up today have some kind of responsibility to that regime. No. And I'll tell you another thing. As somebody who goes to Sarajevo, who goes to Bosnia, who spends probably on average a third of the year there. So I get both the benefit of kind of being there on the ground, but then also going away and seeing it change in some ways, and perhaps more, how can I put it, more obviously than people who are there full time. Without a question, Sarajevo, at least today, is the most prosperous that it has ever been in its modern history. There is no question. Now, if the question is that wealth equally distributed? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Right? But in terms of its connection to the world, the prosperity and the kinds of access to resources, commodities, what you can do in Sarajevo in 2024, I'm sorry, but I will take Sarajevo 24 over Sarajevo 74 every day of the week. And that's a problem for many people in our community, and I'll stop on this, right? Because we actually have this great album that came out a couple of days ago from this Bosnian rapper named Frankie, which is very much in conversation about these themes, right? And he has this great song, Identitet, which is all about this. And here's the thing. we have one of the worst qualities in our community is that it is fundamentally a gerontocracy, i.e., we believe that just because someone is older, that means they know better. No, you don't. No, you don't. Right? Thank you. Right? No, you don't. But here's the thing. That's also not entirely our fault, because that is a product of the fact that generations of our people have lived through authoritarian regimes, successive authoritarian regimes. And authoritarian regimes are hierarchical by definition. And so this is the first time in a very long time that we've had an opportunity for some Jasmin Mujanovic to come along and be like, no, listen, I have some problems with this and I can write a book about it and I can talk about it. And people are like, well, I agree with this, I disagree with that. That's great.
So we went from being discriminated against in an authoritarian regime, which I guess can somewhat be understood. But today, I think Bosniaks, obviously, other than the constitutional discrimination that we are aware of, where our voices are diminished when you vote in Bosnia, etc., we still have a different kind of discrimination happening. I, as a Bosniak American, feel discriminated against all the time by Bosnians. So I want to talk about that a little bit. So, for example, when Bojan Vujic was the ambassador in Washington, D.C., because I'm Bosniak, I was immediately assumed to not be supporting Republika Srpska, and my name was crossed off a list of attendees to events at the embassy. So, and I make sure that people in D.C. are aware of this, and they're in shock, but they couldn't really do anything about it. And then what's even more interesting is, okay, I can expect that maybe from Bojan, who's never met me but thinks I'm a terrorist. But what about Bosnians who say, well, you shouldn't identify as Bosniak because then you're pushing out all the Croats and Serbs who also want to identify as Bosnian and they want to be a part of this Bosnian-ness, right? Where my response to that is, well, I'm both Bosnian and Bosniak. I want to be able to, say I'm Bosnian nationality, I'm Bosniak ethnicity, I'm also a tree hugger, and I love dogs, and these are all aspects of our identity. So what do you say to people who say, let's all stop with the Bosniak stuff and all be Bosnians?
Go ahead. This is the problem with this discourse, is that it is ascribing to people a responsibility and a certain kind of power that A, we can't have, and B, we shouldn't have. We should not be in the business of telling other people how they identify or don't identify. Someone who wants to identify as a Serb, who may be born in Bosnia, whose grandparents are born in Bosnia, who's Bosnian in every sense of the term, who am I to tell him that they can't be a Serb? Who am I to come along and say, no, you're not a Serb, you're an Orthodox Bosnian? I can't say that. I don't have that right. If they want to be a Serb, they can be a Serb.
But we know where that came from.
Of course. But here's what I'm saying. This transposition of responsibility on individuals is completely the wrong framework. The question is not, how do you identify? The question is, should the state and the government have the ability to determine A, how you identify, and B, on the basis of that determination, to allocate or not allocate rights to political participation or representation? And the answer to that is no.
Yes, sorry, but how do you build a nation then?
We'll have questions at the end, we can talk about this.
We had a prime minister in this country, Pierre Trudeau, the father of the current prime minister, who had a great line at the time of the debate about abortion and decriminalization of homosexuality. The state has no place in the bedrooms of the nation. This is the same thing. The issue in Bosnia is not that some people choose or do not choose to identify one way or another. The problem in Bosnia is that the state determines on the basis of that identification whether or not you have a right to representation.
Imagine if we did that in the United States.
Exactly. Exactly.
Because when we say we're American, I would say, well, I don't know, we're a salad bowl, right? We're no longer a melting pot. We're all allowed to identify whatever way we want. But there's something that brings us together that makes us all American.
And here's the thing. I'm right. Yes. And you know why I know I'm right? Because European Convention on Human Rights says I'm right. And half a dozen Bosnian civil rights activists have sued the Bosnian state at the European Court of Human Rights. And in every single instance, the ECHR has said, yes, you are being discriminated against this sectarian ethnic system. We're right. The problem is, to date, that those of us who know that we are right have not yet marshaled the political resources and political capacities to secure the political changes that are required to ensure genuine civic equality and civil rights in Bosnia and Herzegovina.
Why do you think people approach Bosniaks and go, you should be more Bosnian, and they don't approach Croats and Serbs who are trying to tear apart the country and go, you need to be more Bosnian? Why do you think that is? Why do we infight?
I think, again, because we have a categorical misunderstanding of what it means to live in a democratic society. This, again, is a form of trauma. We think that we can change Bosnia through, I don't know what, sitting together over coffee and, dobar je ovo, ko nas ba zavadi? And here's the thing. Here's the other aspect of this that oftentimes gets forgotten, and I know we're running out of time.
No, you're okay. I'm just checking.
When we talk about this idea of Bosnia's constitution needs to be brought in line with the European Convention on Human Rights, people say, "Oh, well, we can't do that. That would be changing the system, and it's ethnic power sharing, blah 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 blah." Meanwhile, Bosnia's population, tutto completo, is disappearing. And all those same people and their compatriots and their own family members who tell you that Bosnia can't have a liberal democratic political regime founded on individual rights and civic equality in line with the liberal democratic norms and standards of the entire democratic world, where do they move? They don't move to Croatia. They don't move to Serbia. They move to Sweden. They move to Canada. They move to Germany. They move to Australia. They move to the United States, places where they will be minorities. Minorities that will not have access to legitimate representation. So here's what that tells us. That tells us that those same people who oppose civic equality and reforms in line with the European Convention on Human Rights in Bosnia are willing to live in those exact same societies that they oppose in Bosnia when they know that they've got guaranteed civic equality. And my point is, you don't have to move to Sweden. Stay here and build that.
Right. And then what do you say to the fact that Croatia refers to Bosniaks living in Herzegovina, who are the most radical HTZ supporters, right, as the diaspora?
Thank you. I brought this point up last night.
Yes. I didn't want you to miss it this time.
Thank you. And people, again, also misunderstand this because they think, like, what's happening now? Why is Jasmin coming out in defense of the HTZ? Here's the thing, or rather their voters, I shouldn't say the party. Here's the thing. I find this an unbelievably offensive term. Croats in Bosnia are not a diaspora. They are indigenous Bosnian Croats. The fact that they choose to identify as ethnic Croats is up to them. They did not move from Croatia. They've been there for just as long as we have been. And so when you tell me that Dragan Čović, the man who sits in the Bosnian presidency every time that the Jelko Komšić can't run, right? When he sits there, and he is a representative of the executive of the Bosnian state, and he tells us simultaneously that Croats in Bosnia are discriminated, while he is a member of the executive, right? He's president of the country, but he's being discriminated against. And then, the same Dragan Čović, it's okay, I can keep yelling, it's fine, everyone's The same Dragan Čović who sits in the Bosnian presidency and says he's discriminated against, then goes to vote in the elections of the Republic of Croatia. So, hang on. What are we talking about here? Pick a lane. Pick a lane. Either you're a foreign national, or you're a national of this country. And if you're a national of this country, then the least that you can do is say that your members of your community are as equal as all other members of this community, or rather of this nation. Because when you castigate them as a diaspora, then somebody very rationally comes along and says, wait a minute, why should we reorganize our political system on the basis of a diaspora? Where else in the world does that exist? And this is the most important part of this. That people think, or they talk about this idea of constitutional reform in Bosnia, as though it would be best for Bosniaks. Like that this is some kind of, sinister agenda. Nah.
And it would be a Bosniak
That's
nation
right.
state, Islamist state.
The communities that would most benefit from bringing Bosnia's constitution in line with the European Convention on Human Rights are those minority communities. Because here's what's going to happen in 20 years. Bosnia already is a 60% Bosniak country. I mean, nobody wants to say that publicly, but when you start putting the numbers together, it becomes very apparent. If it's not already 60, it's going to be in the next 5 years or so. The next 20 years, it's probably going to be closer to 75 if the current trends keep up. Once it's above 60, there is no amount of ethnic gerrymandering that you can do to preserve the existing system. So what I'm saying is, you average SNSD, HDZ voters have the most interest engaging in a reform process today, because 15 years down the road, you're not going to be able to engage in it, even if you want to. That's a danger for your community. Because there will be political opportunists from the Bosniak community who are going to come along and say, well, what are we doing here? Let's just do what we want. Forget that. And that's going to be a very dangerous moment for everyone.
I think we're running out of time, and I'm sure there are a lot of questions, so I really want to leave it up to the audience to ask maybe some of the questions that I wanted to ask you, especially regarding the future. You talk about, there's a lot of really heartbreaking stuff that you talk about in the book, but you still end up on a hopeful note. I'm a hopeful person as well. I think there's a lot of good stuff happening, I hope you get to share that optimism with the audience about what is coming, what's the future, what does it look like, what can we do? Constitutional reform is important. How do we get there? It's not an easy thing to do, not with the people currently in power. How do we get there without the help of the foreign community, like the international community?
So here's what I'll say. I mean, the book goes into quite a bit of length and quite a bit of analysis of, what could constitutional reform look like, blah, blah, blah. Here's what it fundamentally comes down to. We need to understand that democracy is fundamentally rooted in a sense of civic responsibility. If you care about Bosnia, and presumably most of you in this room who are here do, then you have a responsibility to contribute to making it better. The least that you can do is to participate in the democratic process. The Bosnian diaspora, global diaspora, at this point, probably is somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 million people, if not more. At the last Bosnian general elections, barely 60,000 in the diaspora voted.
And I know we worked hard on the North American continent to try to register people to vote, and
Exactly.
It was daunting.
So here's the thing. I understand that there are many people in our community who have reservations about voting while they're in the diaspora. We had a gentleman last night who said to us, why should I, who am living in Seattle or Tacoma or whatever, be deciding what the government of Bosnia should look like when I don't even live there? Okay, fine. Here's the problem with that. Twofold. One, you actually have a legal right. You have a legal right to participate in the democratic political process. So that's number one. Number two, much more importantly, I can guarantee you that the people who hate Bosnia, who want to destroy it, want to tear it apart, who think Ratko Mladic is a hero, who think the Herceg Bosna was the best thing that ever happened to their people, they vote. They vote. They organize campaigns. They vote on everything. They vote in municipal elections, which are coming up in less than 6 months. They vote in general elections. So my question is, why is it that the people who love Bosnia and identify with Bosnia and think it's a good and decent place and that its history, despite all its adversity, is one of commonality and community and overcoming and persevering and defying, why don't they vote? Because that's what it ultimately comes down to. If you do not participate, if you do not get involved, then you abdicate your right, I think, to criticize. It takes 15 minutes to register to vote if you have your Yamabuga, and that's it. And then it'll take you 5 minutes to fill out the ballot. And it's and here's the thing, here's the other major retort. They're all the same. They're all bad. And the guys that I don't, or the guys that I do like, they never get in. Well, the reason for that is that 67,000 vote, and there's like 1 million other people that don't vote. So all those people who are from places like Foča, Prijedor, Srebrenica, Zvornik, Trebinje, you could vote. You could vote. Isn't it interesting that according to the census in 2013, there's more Bosniaks in the Srebrenica and Bratunac area than ethnic Serbs? But the mayor is not just a Serb, he's a fascist. So how is that possible? And the answer is because the people who would elect more progressive options choose not to vote, including progressive Serbs and progressive Croats. Right? And so this is the thing. If you want to change things, you need to get involved. By the way, it'll take a while. And that's okay. Because it's a process. It's a process. And it has to be a process if it's going to be democratic. And the people who tell you that they have solutions, that they have some terminal endpoint to politics, that they have some neat packaged answers, are lying to you. The only thing I'm selling you, aside from the book, the only thing that I'm selling you is the idea that this is going to take a long time. It's going to take a really long time.
And that we all need to put in work.
And the only way to shave time off is by getting more people involved.
Yeah.
That's it. There's no other magic formula.
I think we can leave it at that.
All right,
I
thanks.
think that's a great message. You can go home.
Yeah.
Thank you.